Hi, and welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video, we're going to learn the 2 to 4 player 3000 Scoundrels, designed by Corey Kineska and published by Unexpected Games, who helped sponsor this video. There was a mysterious visitor from the future, known only as the Traveler, who arrived in the Wild West bringing technology from the future, but then disappeared suddenly, leaving all of that tech behind. You may not know how it all works, but you're pretty sure it's worth a fortune. You better scrounge up as much as you can before anyone else does, so join me at the table and let's learn how to play. Before your very first game, find and sort all of these clear cards, which are known as jobs, by the color that you see on their bottom edge. Then add each job to one of these matching colored sleeves, which I've already done. Now these jobs come with a clear plastic film on the front side only, which you can leave on or remove. I have removed mine. To set up, put this game board in the center of the play area with these money tokens nearby. Then take the 3 decks of jobs you created sorted by color and shuffle each of them into a face-down deck. You'll now use this chart found in the rulebook to determine how many of each to use. We'll set up a 2-player game in this video, so we take 4 green, 6 purple, and all of the black cards, stacking them so that the black cards are on the bottom, purple is in the middle, and green is on top. Now find these trait cards, sorting and shuffling them into 2 face-down decks by color. Again, using this chart from the rulebook, collect a number of traits based on your number of players. In our 2-player game, that means 14 blue and all of the red ones, stacking them with the blue ones on top. Put both of your created trait and job decks near the board, and then return all of the unused traits and jobs back to the box. Next, we'll create a scoundrel to add to this saloon. Anytime you need to do this, reveal the top card of each deck, and then slide the trait underneath of the job so that both of them are in the sleeve. You've now created one of the 3,000 possible combinations of scoundrels in the game, which you'll set into this far space. Then we're going to create 2 more scoundrels and add them to the open spaces of the saloon so it looks something like this when you're done. Now find these safe cards and sort them by their 3 colors, shuffling each stack. Then deal a safe face down onto each matching space for them in the middle of the board so it looks something like this when you're done. You'll have 1 safe left over in each color that you'll keep near the board for possible use later. Every player now takes one of these leader sheets and a player reference along with $4 from the supply and the 7 marks, 3 henchmen, and 1 reputation token in their chosen color, as well as the 7 poker cards that match their suit symbol, which is shown here. Each person now adds 1 henchman to this jail area of the board and puts their reputation token on the 0 space of this reputation track. Now shuffle your personal poker cards into a deck and then draw 4 of them into your hand. You can look at these, but make sure you keep them a secret from the other players. Then pick someone randomly to be the first player. And that's the setup. In 3000 Scoundrels, you and the other players each represent a gang from a Wild West town where a traveler from the future has visited with incredible technology. However, they've mysteriously disappeared, leaving all of their advancements ripe for the taking, hidden in safes you'll try to steal before federal marshals arrive to confiscate everything. Collect the most technology before the end of the game, and you'll have the power to shape the wild frontier and win. The game is played over 2 rounds, also known as days, and within each day, players will take turns starting with the first player and continuing clockwise around and around the table. Now I should mention the 2-day version of this game is meant to be played when you're first learning the rules, but once you know them, the designer recommends the 3-round or 3-day version of the game as it allows for greater depth of strategy, and you'll find the details for the changes to the setup this requires here at the back of the rulebook. In the meantime, let's get back to learning about taking a turn. On your turn, you'll complete 3 steps as shown on your player reference, starting with the plan step. Here, you'll choose any 1 poker card from your hand to put face down on any open slot below your leader sheet, announcing the number of the slot out loud. I'm dropping mine on my 3 slot, so I'll announce, I chose slot 3. You do not show the card you played to your slot, and while you only have 4 cards at the start of the day, let's look at all of your cards for a moment. These are numbered from 0 to 6, and there's an ace. The card you add to a slot does not have to match that slot's value, but there's some risk to picking a different number, as we'll see. When the card you play doesn't match the slot value you assigned it to, this is known as bluffing. And you won't want the other players to know when you're bluffing, so keep that in mind because we'll see how that affects things a little later. In future turns, you'll be playing more cards again, but each slot can only have one card in it. So if a card you're holding matches a spot that's already filled, then in a future round, you'll be forced to bluff when you play it. Speaking of which, you can see that the 0 card doesn't match any slot, so you'll have to bluff in order to play it. And that's the plan step. Before we move on to the next step of your turn, I need to stop and explain something that other players at the table can do at any time during your turn, whether you're in the plan step or even one of the later steps of your turn. Each player starts the game with 2 of these henchman tokens, and the third one is in jail, so it can't be used for now. During a player's turn, if another player thinks that they bluffed by adding a card that doesn't match the value of the slot they assigned it to, they can put one of their henchmen on that card. This is called having a suspicion. Now, keep in mind, although you can do this at any point during that player's turn, you can only place a token on the card that they played that turn. You can't add henchmen to cards played on a previous turn. Also, once their turn is over, you can't add any new henchmen to that card anymore. Keep in mind, an opponent cannot place more than one of their henchmen on a single card, but more than one player can call a bluff on the same card if you're in a 3 or 4 player game. Just note you can't add one of your own henchmen to one of your own cards. Any henchmen you play will stay on the cards you add them to until the end of the day, also known as the end of the round. So once you run out of henchmen, you can't call any more bluffs during that day. All right, we've covered the plan step of a player's turn and explained suspicion. So now let's learn about the second step of your turn, using abilities. To help explain this, I've added some scoundrels to my sheet, but don't worry, we'll see how these get added properly in a moment. In this use abilities step, you get to use the abilities on your sheet here and from scoundrels in your gang that show a card value matching the slot you added a card to during your planned step. For example, I chose slot 3, so I can use this ability showing a 3 and this ability that shows a 3. Now a scoundrel like this can actually be resolved when either a 3 or 5 slot is used. When you have more than one ability matching the slot you picked, you resolve them in any order, just making sure that you fully resolve one ability before you resolve the next. Also keep in mind, it doesn't matter what value is actually on the card that I placed here. It's the value of the slot which indicates which abilities can resolve. And just know, you don't ever have to resolve a scoundrel or sheet ability if you don't want to, but once you start resolving one of them, you must complete that ability as much as you can, unless its effect says you may do something, in which case it means that part of the effect is optional. Now with that understood, let's look at some of the abilities that you'll encounter. Slot 3 and 4 of your sheet are very simple. You just gain the related amount of money that it says from the supply. And if you ever run out of money in the supply, just use a suitable replacement. If you're resolving an ace or 2 slot, you're told to scout a safe and then mark it. To do this, pick any safe card and secretly look at it without showing anyone else, and then after, you put it back. The value you saw is how much that safe is worth. And as we'll learn later, players can steal the safes from this board, gaining that value in points. So the higher the value, the better the safe. At each of these 3 sites, you'll find one of these dials, and this will tell you the potential values of the cards that it has. And remember that during setup, one card of each site was set aside. After scouting a safe and putting it back, you must add one of your double-sided marks to it with either side face up. The value of the mark does not have to match the value you saw on the safe, but as we'll see later, this token will be worth 1 point if it does match to whoever steals this safe later. On the other hand, adding a different value to a safe is a way of potentially misleading players about what value you saw. Did you see a 2? Maybe add your 6th token just to keep people wondering. And during the game, you can look at any safe card you previously added a mark to, so don't worry about having to memorize their values. Over the course of the game, there's no limit to how many marks each player can have on a site, which means you could scout and mark this safe again later to add another token to it. So that's scouting. Now let's look at the effect you can resolve at slot 5, where it says you can steal a safe. To do this, you take any safe from the main board, whether or not it has marks on it. But if it does have marks, be sure to take those as well. You then add it to the leftmost empty space at the top of your sheet here. Just know you can never have more safes than the value of the current day. For example, on day 1, you can't have more than 1 safe. But on day 2, you can have up to 2. And when you're playing the full game of 3 days that we discussed earlier, you'll use this final slot on that last day. Once you have a safe, you can look at its value at any time. But again, you can't show it to anyone else. However, you can always say anything you like about them. I could take a safe from the board and go, oh, rats, only a 2, when actually it's a 6. And bluffing isn't the only trick up your sleeve. Making deals is another option. For example, if someone has an ability that would let them steal your money, you could promise to never steal from them if they just leave you alone. However, promises like this are not binding. If you want to break your promise later, you can. That covers all of the abilities on your sheet. And notice, the 6th slot doesn't have a related ability, but many scoundrels will have abilities that trigger from that value. And we're going to look at scoundrel abilities in this video, but I think they'll make more sense if we finish explaining the rest of a player's turn first. As we know, you first plan, then use abilities, and finally, you must either hire a scoundrel or use the sheriff's office. To hire a scoundrel, pick one of the 3 that are face up in the saloon and pay its cost. The cost of a scoundrel is the number of dollar icons showing on its right. I've taken this scoundrel apart just to show you that its total cost comes from both cards being combined. So this scoundrel's total cost is $6. Some scoundrels will have bullet holes on their job half, which will cover up some portion of its potential trait cost. So this scoundrel, instead of costing 3 plus 1, when you put them together, it will only cost 2. After paying the cost of the scoundrel you hired, you then place it into any open space of your sheet. And then you may freely rearrange all scoundrels you have as you like. Right now we only have 1, but let's pretend it's later in the game and we had these 2 as well. So after hiring this scoundrel, now we can freely rearrange these. Why you might want to do this we'll learn about later, but hiring a scoundrel is the only time you can rearrange the ones that you have. Let's say for a moment all of our spaces were full. If you hire a scoundrel when you have no open spaces, discard one you have to make room for it. This is the only time you can remove a scoundrel that you have. And again, after adding the new one, you can then rearrange them if you want. After a scoundrel is removed from the face-up display, immediately fill all empty spaces by moving the ones that remain as far right as possible. And then you create a new scoundrel from the top cards of the 2 decks and set it into the leftmost space. Rather than hiring a scoundrel in the 3rd step of your turn, you can instead use the sheriff's office, which is found in this area of the board. To do this, as it says here, you first discard the rightmost scoundrel in the display, and then refill the saloon as we just saw, creating a new scoundrel to put into the empty space. Then you may pick one of these 3 listed options to perform. For example, we can sell information, gaining $2 from the supply. Or we can post bail by spending $2 to free a henchman, taking it back from jail. Soon we'll see how more henchmen can end up here. So you also have the option to instead spend $4 to free 2 henchmen at once. And just know, when freeing henchmen, it doesn't have to be one of yours. You can free another player's henchman if you want, returning it to them. The final option is to bribe the sheriff, which can only be done on the last day of the game. You spend $12 and then you get to steal any safe you like from the board. And that's how you take a turn. After performing your 3 steps, the next player in clockwise order takes their turn, and around the table you'll go until everyone has had 4 turns, which is also how many poker cards you started the day with. At this point, it's time to resolve the end of day phase, and the steps for this are shown on the back of your player reference, starting with calling bluffs. Each player, one at a time, in turn order, now reveals any of the cards in their poker slots that have henchman tokens on them. Any card that matches the value of the slot it was put into is not a bluff, and the tokens that have been set on it are now put in jail. On the other hand, any revealed card that doesn't match the slot it was put into is a bluff that's been caught. And each player who had put their henchman on that card gains 1 reputation and then takes their henchman back. Also, the player whose card it was now loses a single reputation for each of their cards that was caught in a bluff, no matter how many henchmen were on it. So let's say we were in a 3-player game and the card we had revealed had these 2 henchmen on it. This means yellow and green would each earn 1 reputation, and the player whose card this was would lose 1. Anytime you gain or lose reputation, move your marker up or down this track. If you ever reach the ends of the track, you just don't move your marker any further in that direction. Now, just to be clear, you only reveal the poker cards that had henchmen on them. You don't reveal any others. Some of these might have been bluffs, but no one else will know for sure. After the henchmen are resolved, if it's the final day, the game ends. Otherwise, you go to step 2, shuffling played cards. Here, each player shuffles the poker cards they played this round, adding them to the bottom of their poker deck. They are not shuffled into the rest of them, they're just put onto the bottom. Finally, each player draws cards until they're holding 4. Now, normally this means they'll draw 4, but due to special abilities, they may still have some cards left over from the previous round, in which case they only draw as many as necessary to be holding 4 again. Now it's time to begin a new day where the player with the highest reputation decides who will go first. If there's a tie for highest reputation, don't change the turn order and just start with the player who went first during the previous day. And that's how a day works, which means we now know enough to go back and look at some of the Scoundrels and learn how their various abilities work. Most will have a value here indicating which slot a player has to assign a card to for this Scoundrel to be used. If there's more than one value, like we see here, then this Scoundrel can be used whenever either slot is filled. Then you're able to resolve its ability that's listed in this area. In this case, we gain $2 and then pick a player and steal $1 from them. Instead of a poker card icon, sometimes you'll have specific text telling you when your Scoundrel can act. Here it happens after one of your henchmen is sent to jail. A card like this can be used during any player's turn when the conditions apply, but remember, an ability can only be used once per turn, and once per end of day phase if it would apply at that time. Now, if more than one player ever wants to use an ability at the end of day, the player who most recently took a turn decides the order that they'll resolve in. If an effect says that it resolves at the start of your turn, that means it happens before you play a card in step 1 of your turn. As a quick reminder, you never have to resolve an ability if you don't want to. So I could ignore this start of turn effect if I wanted, but if I do decide to use it, it must happen at the very start of my turn. A Scoundrel with the when hired effect is resolved as soon as they're hired, and then they're discarded immediately instead of being added to your sheet. Now again, you're not forced to resolve their ability if you don't want to, but you must still discard them after they're hired. Some traits will have an arrow in this area. This is called a response. Their effects are resolved after you use a Scoundrel on the other end of its arrow. In other words, if my board looked like this and I used this Scoundrel, after its effect resolved, I would then follow this line and resolve this ability as well. Some traits will have a plus $1 bonus here. This gains you $1 each time you use the Scoundrel's ability. Other traits may have this use twice bonus. Now remember, normally you can only use the Scoundrel's ability once per turn, but here you get to resolve its ability twice, fully resolving it once, then immediately resolving it a second time before moving on to other effects, including responses you might have. Now, if a use twice Scoundrel would normally be discarded, like this effect says, then be sure to resolve its effect twice before discarding it. Also, just because an effect lets you use the ability twice, you don't have to. You can always just use it once if you want, because, as we know, resolving an ability is optional. Some scoundrels, like this horse, will let you use one of your other scoundrels. If so, you ignore any parts of the targeted scoundrel that say when it can be used, and you just immediately resolve its effect. So if I used the horse and picked this generous banker, normally I could only use my generous banker at the start of my turn if I have $0. But now it doesn't matter that it's not the start of my turn, and it also doesn't matter how much money I have. Instead, I can just resolve this effect, which would gain me $8. If an effect lets you scout a poker card, this just means you secretly look at another player's poker card without showing anyone else and then put it back where it was, unless the effect says otherwise. And unlike scouting safes, you don't mark poker cards. Considering that there are 3,000 possible scoundrels you could create, we're not going to go over every card ability in this video, as how they work is described on them. But if you have any questions when playing, you can refer to this handy card glossary you'll find in the rulebook. So as we mentioned, after each player has taken 4 turns, you complete the end of day phase, and then start a new day, unless it's the end of day 2. In which case, after calling any bluffs, it's time for final scoring. First, reveal your safes and add up any tech values showing on it here. Then you gain 1 point for each mark that was on a tech card that matches its value. And this could include marks from an opponent. So in this case, we'd get 5 points plus 1 for this matching mark, and then 2 points for this tech. Now check all of the scoundrels on your sheet and gain 1 point for any that have a tech icon in this area here. Finally, check this reputation area of the board and then add or subtract the related value from your score. The player with the highest tech score wins. In the case of a tie, the tied player with the most money left over wins. And if there's still a tie, the tied player who took the most recent turn wins. At the back of the rulebook, you'll find an option to play with strategy cards, which players are given at the start of the game, picking one to keep, which will provide them with an ongoing ability as they play. But this option I'll leave for you to discover on your own. Otherwise, that's everything you need to know to play 3,000 Scoundrels. If you have any questions at all about anything you saw here, feel free to put them in the comments below and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. You'll also find forums for discussion, pictures, other videos, and lots more over on the games page at Board Game Geek, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and clicking that little bell icon so you get notification anytime we post a new video. And if you'd like to support us directly, you can join our Patreon team, which I'll have linked below. But until next time, thanks for watching.